see you all, and just take off from where we left off last week. Let's just first gather ourselves, God's holy and other presence. Lord God, as we gather together in this Easter week, we do so cognizant of your Son's death and resurrection and his unveiling of new life for all of us. Help us to truly live for the truth of that life that conquers death, that light that overcomes darkness, that grace that destroys or comes from sin and transforms sin. And let us truly live in the new reality your Son, Jesus Christ, our crucified and risen Lord, gives us now and forever. Amen. Okay, I will quickly just lead us in some reflection. If you remember last week, we ended in the midst of the trumpets as they were being blown, chapter 8 and into chapter 9 of Revelation. And I wanted to just note this one thing. In Eugene Peterson's book, he quotes a medieval theologian, Richard of St. Victor. And, because remember we're talking about, we're sort of in the midst of language that is a lot like the language of or utilizing the language of the plagues in Exodus, right? And then, of course, as we'll look here in a moment, from the prophet Joel, and this whole idea of the locusts, and Joel's usage of that imagery on his infamous or famous Day of the Lord in chapter 2 of his book. So again, all of these echoes to so many other passages of Scripture, right? Well, anyway, Richard of St. Victor, who I think he lived like in the 13th or the 14th century, he wrote this. Remember, the plagues are all about Egypt, and, they launched the Israelites into their journey to leave Egypt, right? And he says this, "But first we must leave Egypt behind. First we must cross the Red Sea. First the Egyptians must perish in the waves. First we must suffer famine in the land of Egypt before we can receive this spiritual nourishment and heavenly food. He who desires that food of heavenly solitude, let him abandon Egypt, both in body and in heart, and altogether set aside the love of the world. Let him cross the Red Sea. Let him try to drive all sadness and bitterness out of his heart if he desires to be filled with inward sweetness. First the Egyptians must be swallowed up. Let perverse ways perish, lest the angelic citizens disdain an ignoble companion. First the foods of Egypt must fail, and carnal pleasure be held in abomination before we may experience the nature of those inner and eternal pleasures." So he's playing on the idea, which of course is ancient and Christian, or even Jewish understanding. Various of the rabbis said that all 613 commandments of Torah can be boiled down to one reality. Well, I guess one reality expressed two different ways. The first way is don't make any idol. Okay? Don't make an idol. An idol is something always less than God. The other way that that's expressed is don't go back to Egypt. Okay? So all of the 613 mitzvot, the 613 commandments of Torah, are basically about setting a trajectory by which one is supposed to leave Egypt behind, right? And all that that connotes, right? And so these sort of, echoes of the plague language want to say that if one is not leaving Egypt behind, then you're not just going to get what you thought was good, you're going to get also what was destructive. Because ultimately, when one settles for an idol, one puts oneself not in relation to the living God, but something that is less than God. And that will ultimately bring about, heartache and heartbreak and, destruction. Okay? And so we're sort of seeing that unfold as the trumpets are blown and all of, creation, which we looked at last week as sort of representative of the bringing about of order and cosmos from disorder and chaos, that it sort of seems to be returning to disorder and chaos, right? Because one fundamentally is not leaving, quote, Egypt behind. And so in John's theological imagination, as he sort of is, or his apocalyptic imagination in the book of Revelation, he sees Rome as sort of this Egypt on steroids, right? And those that want to sell themselves out to the empire in small ways or large ways as basically choosing to go back to Egypt or deciding for Rome, right? Deciding for false worship and not true worship, not worship of the living God. All right? So, anyway, let's just back up a tiny bit to the beginning of chapter 9. I know that we had sort of looked at it initially. This is with the fifth angel. Then we had the first four angels, and then you got now the triple woe, the warning of what's about to come next, right? The fifth angel blew his trumpet, and I saw a star that had fallen from heaven to earth. Remember, this is probably like one of the powers of heaven. So, an angel or an angelic-like entity, creature, a demon also. They were sometimes used, the language of star could refer to them. I saw a star that had fallen from heaven to earth, and he was given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit. He opened the shaft of the bottomless pit, and from the shaft rose smoke like the smoke of a great furnace. And the sun and the air were darkened with the smoke from the shaft. Then from the smoke came locusts on the earth, and they were given authority like the authority of scorpions of the earth. They were told not to damage the grass of the earth or any green growth or any tree, but only those people who did not have the seal of God on their foreheads, right? The seal of the living God. They were allowed to torture them for 5 months, but not to kill them, and their torture was like the torture of a scorpion when it stings someone, and in those days people will seek death, but will not find it. They will long to die, but death will flee from them. We talked about that a little bit. Let's just quickly go on, and then I'm going to draw us to look at the book of the prophet Joel in the Old Testament. In appearance, the locusts were like horses equipped for battle. On their heads, by the way, I need to, a long time ago, when I was sort of like in a much more impressionable mode of my life, and I was watching, I think it was at that time, the Trinity Broadcast Network, and they had some late night guy claiming, oh yes, this was right when Operation Desert Storm had started. You guys remember that? Not that you remember what I was watching on one late night when I was like 18 years old or 17 years old. Anyway, they said, oh, this is the book of Revelation unfolding right before our eyes, and those things that the book of Revelation described as these weird-looking locusts, that's helicopters, from the American military invading Iraq, right? Or Kuwait and Iraq and all of that. And so I was like, oh, that's sort of interesting. I didn't stay very long in that mindset, But anyway, that would be a very fundamentalistic read of this particular part, right? But they were like so for sure that this is exactly what was being, foretold, both in the prophet Joel, which Revelation gets some of its symbology from, among other works, but also, they were so convinced that this was, what was actually being referenced by the book of Revelation than Operation Desert Storm back in 1990. Okay, well, anyway, I'm not convinced by that, okay, nor should you. But, so, anyway, in appearance, the locusts were like horses equipped for battle. On their heads were what looked like crowns of gold. Their faces were like human faces, their hair like women's hair, and their teeth like lions' teeth. They had scales like iron breastplates, and the noise of their wings was like the noise of many chariots with horses rushing into battle. They have tails like scorpions with stingers, and in their tails is their power to harm people for 5 months. And they have as king over them the angel of the bottomless pit. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, which means destruction, and in Greek is called Apollyon, or the destroyer is what that term. So the Greek word and the Hebrew word, it's interesting the reference to that, both in Hebrew and in Greek. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, let's first look at the prophet Joel. Okay, so that's one of the minor prophets, minor meaning in terms of length, not as long as like Isaiah or Ezekiel or Jeremiah, right? But if you would go to Joel, the book of Joel, chapter 2, verse, well, let's just start at, go to verse 1, because you got to get the whole context. This is the day of the Lord, the mysterious day of the Lord. And he sort of sees, he's bringing together plague language, but also the language of invasion by a foreign power, right? So think of, their chariots or their horses. Remember in the ancient world, the chariot and the horse, that was the tank of the time, right? A man or an invading force on with horses and chariots. Remember, we just sort of sang that as that God was even mightier than all of Pharaoh's forces that were arrayed against the Israelites in Exodus 14 and 15, which functions as one of the key readings of the Easter Vigil. Some of you were at, right? And perhaps some of you from other parishes. In that reading of the 7 Old Testament readings is required, right? We can choose among the others, but that one about the Passover and the victory of God leading his people through the Red Sea is required, right? And remember that perhaps one of the most ancient parts of the book of Exodus is the poetic version of that in Exodus 15, right? Horse and chariot is flung into the sea, right? God is mightier, if you will, than the great superpower of the time, right? In the Egyptian military and all of that, right? Horse and chariot, he's cast or flung into the sea. So there's always that sense that that the invading forces seem sort of like indomitable, right? That they couldn't, or unstoppable. They couldn't be stopped. And also remember, when you had situations of a natural occurrence, like, we've seen them in our own time, all of a sudden, like a plague of locusts occurs, right? Just what a destructive effect they could have on the agriculture of the local place and things like that. So those sort of very real-world negative experiences, right, are sort of, in a sense, utilized by the prophet Joel as, again, remember what the prophets seek to do is they seek to, on the one hand, console suffering people, but then on the other hand is sometimes, and strongly, to indict or to challenge people in positions of power, right? And effectively, Joel is sort of saying this, that when this day of the Lord, this mysterious day of Yahweh, day of the Lord comes, it's going to be like, he's sort of been drawing the comparison, right, using the metaphor of like an invading force, right, like an army that invades, or like locusts, that can just like completely destroy a field of crops and things like that. So let's just sort of read several of the verses of chapter 2 from the book of Joel. Right? Blow the horn in Zion. Here's the language of blowing of the horn, the shofar, right? Which, of course, these trumpets have been sounding in the Revelation text. Blow the horn in Zion, sound the alarm on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. Right? This is the Yom Yahweh, the day of the Lord. Yes, it approaches, a day of darkness and gloom. And we have that language of the darkness and the gloom. By the way, that also harks back to one of the plagues, right? The 9th plague is darkness, okay? In the book of, and there in Exodus chapter 10, right? Yes, it approaches a day of darkness and gloom, a day of thick clouds, like dawn spreading over the mountains, right? A vast and mighty army, right? Like this light that comes, sort of this interesting bringing together of different darkness and yet like the dawn as like the sun rising, and it begins to shine or illuminate everything as it rises higher. Nothing like it has ever happened in ages past, nor will the future hold anything like it, even in the most distant generations. Before it, fire devours. Behind it, flame scorches. By the way, are any of you like into classical music? Or I'm sort of a fan of different versions of the Mass of the Dead, the Requiem Mass. And perhaps one of the most sort of like over-the-top dramatic versions of this is Verdi's Dies Irae, right? Which, of course, is not exactly the text of Joel. It's a Latin poem, but based a lot of the imagery of the judgment, of the dead and humanity and stuff like that will happen. But if you ever have a chance, you should probably you can Google or use your Spotify or whatever. But listen to Verdi's, as the Dies Irae, the sequence that simply means the Latin for the day of wrath, or the day of anger. That begins, and of course, Verdi, Italian operatic master that he was, it's just over the top, right? So anyway, it sort of gets at some of this idea here in a musical way. Before it, fire devours. Behind it, flame scorches. The land before it is like the Garden of Eden, right? Which would be lush and verdant, right? And behind it, a desolate wilderness. From it, nothing escapes. So it's like all of a sudden, right, the undoing of creation. Like the garden of creation all of a sudden becomes this parched, arid, lifeless land. Their appearance is that of horses. Like war horses, they run, like the rumble of chariots. They hurtle across the mountains, like the crackling of fiery flames, devouring stubble, right? Like a massive army in battle formation. So this imagery of the invading force, but then also the locusts, right? Before them, peoples tremble. Every face turns pale. Like warriors, they run. Like soldiers, they scale walls, each advancing in line without swerving from the course. No one crowds the other. Each advances in its own track. Right? They plunge through the weapons. They are not checked. They charge the city. They run upon the wall. They climb into the houses through the windows. They enter like thieves. Before them, the earth trembles. The heavens shake. Sun and moon are darkened, and the stars withhold their brightness. The Lord raises his voice at the head of his army. How immense is his host. How numerous those who carry out his command. How great is the day of the Lord. Right? Utterly terrifying. Who can survive it? Right? And then, of course, it's interesting. You see, this real, just massive image of destruction, destructive power, force. And it's like, you know, and this is so typical of the prophets. Really, all of the prophets. You get this powerful, indicting, condemning, you know, destructive passage, right? And then all of a sudden, it's followed by something hope-filled. Like, you know, it's you know, in some sense, it's almost, you know, sort of schizophrenic, if you will. It's like all of a sudden there's this way, and then it switches, right? Because what this is supposed to prompt is, you know, hopefully transformation, right? So in verse 12, which, by the way, that this sort of functions as the first reading that we always hear on Ash Wednesday, right? Yet even now, says the Lord, return to me with your whole heart, with fasting, weeping, and mourning. Rend your hearts, not your garments, and return to the Lord your God. For he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, and relenting in punishment. Perhaps he will again relent and leave behind a blessing. Anyway, so that continues. So you get this strong language of, you know, the day of the Lord and darkness and destruction, that just upsets the order of everything, right? So John is very much sort of working in that same vein, or using echoes of that language from Joel, and then, like I said, other passages, particularly the passages about the plagues in Exodus, right? So you have this language of these, you know, strange-looking creatures that are going to bring about the destruction of creation, or so it seems, right? These locusts, they were like horses equipped for battles, like a war horse, right? They're in particularly chapter 2 of Joel, verse 4, right? And in chapter 1, by the way, he has actually specifically laid out a locust invasion. So, you know, that's chapter 1. And then chapter 2 sort of like amplifies that, I should say. So real quick, in chapter 1, and this is how Joel begins, right? Listen to this, you elders, pay attention, all who dwell in the land. Has anything like this ever happened in your lifetime or in the lifetime of your ancestors? Report it to your children. Have your children reported to their children and their children to the next generation. What the cutter left, the swarming locust has devoured. What the swarming locust left, the hopper has devoured. What the hopper left, the consuming locust has devoured. And then, etc., right? So it's building upon that language of the destruction of, like, the natural order, right? And then sort of amplified with the destruction of the social order, with like an invading military force. And so, you know, Revelation, not to be outdone, amplifies that even more, right? These locusts are bizarre-looking creatures, but of course we've seen Revelation's fascination for bizarre-looking creatures, their usage of the, you know, the eagle, the four living creatures. You know, it looks like an eagle, looks like a strange-looking human, looks like an ox, it looks like a lion. We've seen the idea of the slaughtered and yet living lamb, right? So it's this imagery that sort of defies imagination, or certainly stretches the imagination to really try to conceive of what's going on here. Okay, so now we've had these locusts that are sort of like scorpions, and they have women's hair and lions' teeth and human faces and iron breastplates, and they make this horrible noise, right? So it's just the complete overwhelming of the order of things, huh? And they have this king over them, the angel, who's this star that fell, right? From, and so he's out of, remember I talked last week about, in the Hebrew mindset, it's the whole idea of clean and unclean, and pure, impure, right, is all about everything has its appropriate order, or it's out of order, it's disordered. So see, everything's disordered now. You have this angel that is out of its order, right, and now it has this, it's termed in Hebrew Abaddon, the destruction, literally, or in Greek, it's referred to as Apollyon, so the destroyer. Huh? Okay, so let's just continue. So notice that this fifth trumpet, it's a lot more sort of developed. You had the first four, things were bad, and now with the fifth one, it grew from bad to worse, right? And now we'll have the sixth trumpet to come. And remember that these last three trumpets are also referred to as woes, right? So this was the first woe that the eagle was crying out that was going to come to pass. The first woe has passed. There's still two woes to come, right? Then the sixth angel blew his trumpet, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar before God, and this, of course, would have looked very much like, in the midst of the sanctuary of the temple, right? Again, going to, in Exodus 27. Yeah, let's look at that real quick. Exodus 27, verse 2. Again, just sort of showing how he is calling upon different imagery passages from the Old Testament. So in Exodus 27:2, right, this is about the altar for the burnt offerings, right? And it's the schematics. So in Exodus 27, you shall make an altar of acacia wood on a square 5 cubits long and 5 cubits wide. It shall be 3 cubits high. At the four corners, make horns, right? And this is maybe like the horn of a ram or a goat or an ox. It's a common Old Testament figure for strength and dignity. They represent the divine character of the altar itself, or the deity worshipped there, right? So at the four corners of the altar of sacrifice, burnt offerings, the Holocaust altar, make horns that are of one piece with the altar. You shall then plate it with bronze. Huh? Okay, so again, the imagery that Revelation is calling to mind is coming from different parts of the Old Testament. So the sixth angel blows his trumpet. I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar before God, saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, right? Release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. Right? That's one, of course, the main rivers of, which humans surround, which human civilization or civilized humanity began, right? It flows through what is modern day Iraq. This was Babylon and all of that. Release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. So the four angels were released who had been held ready for the hour, the day, the month, and the year to kill a third of humankind. The number of the troops of cavalry was 200 million. I heard their number. So it's this gigantic, right? I think literally the Greek says twice 10,000 times 10,000, right? But that's what the Greek is literally saying. So, that's 200 million. It's this vast number. So it's like this sort of overwhelming force arrayed or allied against creation. And this was how I saw the horses in my vision. The riders wore breastplates, the color of fire and of sapphire, or hyacinth, and of sulfur. The heads of the horses were like lions' heads, and fire and smoke and sulfur came out of their mouths. By these 3 plagues, a third of humankind was killed by the fire and smoke and sulfur coming out of their mouths. Right? So the 3, quote, plagues are the fire, the smoke, and the sulfur that comes out of their mouths. For the power of the horses is in their mouths and in their tails. Their tails are like serpents having heads, and with them they inflict harm. Okay, so we just have this complete and utter imagery of destruction and the weirdness of this image. These horses that have these weird-looking heads, they're breathing sulfur and fire and smoke. Their tails are like serpents. You know, you got into this is pretty weird. So, just basically to establish that. Okay, so it's this radical undoing of the order of everything, right? Let me just note this also. This is what Peterson says, especially when he's talking about the darkness that comes, right? The darkening of the luminaries, like the sun, the moon, and the stars, throws a shadow over all of life. Now all of the elements, earth, salt water, fresh water, heavens, remember that was early in Revelation chapter 8, it gets amplified, are under judgment. And I think I made this point. Genesis made it clear that everything we see is a result of God's creative will. Revelation makes it clear that everything is subject to God's creative judgment. When any of the great elements of creation get between us and God, becoming idols, right? Judgment topples them and restores us to simple trust and adoration. Every misplaced trust and every mistaken devotion is called into question. And so, here's the point. When any of this is going to happen, or however any of this is going to happen, right? Or just in lines of the narrative, there's no escaping it, right? You're not going to outwit this. One is not going to be sort of smarter than what the only thing that one can do in the middle of this is to recenter oneself in prayer, right? Yeah, you can sort of assume all of the logistics of the preppers, right? And your your buried houses and or safe houses and things like that. But this is the undoing of the order of creation. And as Peterson is saying here, right? As creation is undone, the only thing that one can conceivably hope for or put their trust in is God alone, right? So, we just marked liturgically the Paschal mystery in the Passion, the suffering, the death, and then ultimately the resurrection of Jesus, right? But the crucifixion, the Passion, the suffering, and the death, at that moment, evil is having its way, right? And there's it's an interesting sort of figure to sort of focus on in that scene of the cross, right? And it's the figure of the mother of Jesus, of Mary, right? And we could wonder, how come she's not protesting or, raising or shaking her fists at the Roman military establishment or the Jewish religious leaders or the heavens, right, or God, right? in a sense, there's another passage that I want to draw your attention to, and it comes from the book of Lamentations. Okay, so if you go to Lamentations, which follows Jeremiah, Lamentations is all about looking at and considering the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. The Babylonians came in and basically sort of razed it, R-A-Z-E-D, destroyed it, destroyed the temple, put its leadership class into exile, right? There was really nothing they could do, huh? Lamentations begins, it's just this forlorn, forsaken, sort of like the words of Jesus on the cross in Matthew's and Mark's gospel from Psalm 22. My God, why have you abandoned me, or why have you forsaken me, right? Lamentations begins that way. How solitary or how lonely sits the city once filled with people. She who was great among the nations is now like a widow. Once a princess among the provinces, now a toiling slave. Right, God, this is complete reversal. But if you go further into this, if you're really having a super bad day, I wouldn't recommend reading the book of Lamentations. Okay? But in some sense, it might be good though too. But further into it, in chapter 3, starting at verse 25 and following, you have this. The Lord is good to those who trust in him. It's interesting. To the one who seeks him. And here it is. It is good to hope in silence for the Lord's deliverance. I mean, we don't really live in a very silent age. Everybody wants to be outraged. I had somebody yesterday, I really wrestled about wanting to share this or not, but I'm going to do it. They'll probably get me into trouble, but oh well. After the 8 o'clock Mass, we had a lot of people at Masses yesterday, and someone, I guess, was waiting to get in for the 9:30 Mass, and of course the Masses were going a little bit over, as were they being, pretty filled, more than normal, right? And so someone came up to me in a sort of a, what typically happens to me, in a hit and run mode, right? They want to drop a bomb on me and then oh, happy Easter, Father, which of course ticks me off to no end. So anyway, this particular person said, I guess I won't get my seat. I won't get my seat at Mass. And I had this, I can't remember the term that was used to refer to a lot of these people, but yeah, of course, they show up maybe once, twice, 3 times a year. Okay? But anyway, this particular person was just having a big thing about it and wanted to make sure that I sort of get caught up in the cycle of protests that they were lodging. And I said, well, it's Easter Sunday. That didn't help. But anyway, it was just sort of an example of, first of all, I thought, God, what an entitled person you are. And secondly, maybe show a little compassion. If I had my wits about me in the moment, which usually I don't, it's after the fact, I sort of think about these things. I would have said, have you ever read the parable of the prodigal son and his older brother? or maybe just reference the fact of the history of where this church happens to find itself, which, as you know, it was when it was built that was of course the red light district of Fort Worth, Texas, right? And lovingly referred to as Hell's Half Acre, right? Which of course is where, interestingly, I've reflected on this before, the Church of Jesus Christ ought to sort of be. Jesus was accused of being a friend of tax collectors, prostitutes, and sinners, right? Even those people that only come 2 or 3 times a year for church, right? But of course, those are all things that I think of after the fact. But then it sort of, I sort of was referencing the fact, or later I was thinking, God, how much in this modern society, people have got to always register their complaint. They can't ever, in some sense, as the text of Lamentations there, hope in silence. And of course, social media just blows this up to the heights of heaven. They are going to have their 10 minutes or 1 minute of outrage, and all is going to be well with the world. And of course it's not. But anyway, the image here that I'm wanting you to sort of focus on is this image of Mary at the foot of the cross, right? Evil is having its way. And all she can do is hope in silence, right? It's good to hope in silence for the Lord's deliverance. It is good for a person when young to bear the yoke, to sit alone and in silence when its weight lies heavy, to put one's mouth to the dust. There may yet be hope, because that's one of the strongest acts of, if you will, moral rectitude that there is. That even though it appears like the empire is having its way, the injustice and cruelty of bad religion mixed with bad politics that brought about the death of Jesus, it appears as if it is, the darkness is indeed enveloping the creation, right? And yet, even in the midst of that, though, the Blessed Mother still stands giving witness to the cruel injustice of the cross, but from the vantage point of hope, right? Not whining and complaining for the sake of whining and complaining that I'm not going to get my precious pew place. Let's consider the greater reality of things. So, to put one's mouth to the dust, there may yet be hope. Imagine the citizens and the people of Jerusalem, the survivors, if you will, looking out across their desolate city, having just been razed and destroyed by the overwhelming force of the Babylonians. Their temple, which was in their imagination, their image, the dwelling place of God on earth, gone. Right? And so I think that offers some perspective, so that when ultimately what Revelation is saying, as the judgment, if you will, or as the destruction unfolds and it appears completely inevitable, right? What is one supposed to do? At that moment, all one can do is trust in God. Right? Is trust in God. The language, even those most forlorn words of Jesus on the cross, as articulated in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, my God, why have you abandoned me? They are the beginning of a psalm, where course, it doesn't take away from the fact it's the most forlorn and desolate part of the psalm. And sure, that's all he can give voice to at that moment. But of course, the trajectory of Psalm 22, which is what it is, which is sort of typical of a psalm of lamentation, will end in a note of hope and trust. That if I can speak the angst and the anxiety and the abandonment and the overwhelming quality of whatever is happening to the one who can do something about it, that then I can place my hope and trust in God. See, and that's the thing that in the story of the narratives of the desert, of Israel journeying through the desert from Egypt to the promised land, that they seem to always not get, right? They always are complaining and whining for the flesh pots of Egypt, right? That their bellies were full, or that they had, water and bread, and, whatever they sort of thought gave them a semblance or a sense of identity. Never mind the fact that they were enslaved, but that they seem to be able to sort of fail to trust and place their hope in God in the present moment. They're always sort of like nostalgic for this past, which is dangerous. Or they're sort of like put themselves so far in this far-flung future that's not yet there. They fail to sort of be able to, in some sense, and in some moments of our lives, all we can do is put our mouth to the dust and hope. Right? And I know that's not very American at all. But, I think in some sense, that's what the deep invitation to live from a true vantage point of faith, that we're no longer in the metaphorical, as I said many times, shallow part of the pool. Right? We're in the deep part. Jesus tells Simon Peter to put out into the deep. That's where he'll get his catch of fish. It's not in the easily, very well-known and surveilled waters up close to the shore. But it's out in the deep, because that's only, that's like the liminal experience. That's the desert. That's the wilderness. That's the cross. As I've said over and over and over and over again. Right? And so that when this sort of happens, the seemingly, the people, I'll have like everything absolutely prepared so I can survive that point. The only thing that's going to allow one to be able to live through that is just putting their complete and radical trust in God. Death may still even come, but that's the whole point of the cross and the empty tomb and the resurrection, is that God in Christ doesn't avoid death. He goes straight into death. Right? There's no going around it. And so that when this, if you will, whatever this is, occurs or happens, right? We sort of have ourselves planted, hopefully, in this notion or this, idea, which again is very difficult, of an abiding trust or faith in God. When all of the comforts of creation, when all of the structures of creation, when everything, right, that is sort of has buttressed our lives and our, our mindsets and all of that, when all of that comes crumbling down, that what will still remain is one's, faith or trust in God, right? There's a new movie out, or I don't know if it's out, or I heard it was coming out. It's an interesting take on the whole story of the offering of Isaac, right? The sacrifice of Abraham. Have you heard about this? I think it's the same people that produced The Chosen. And so it's on the story of Abraham and Isaac. And I remember one time, I've always been very, very taken by Genesis 22, which is the story of, the Jews call it the binding of Isaac. In the Christian tradition, we typically refer to it as the sacrifice of Abraham, but it's both. And I just love it, again, well-meaning people who seem to, they have all the answers. They seem to think, oh yeah, that passage is just so easily explainable. And I go, really? Genesis 22? If someone were to do that today, they would be quickly carted off to the 9th floor of JPS, right? For, saying that, oh yeah, God told me to sacrifice my son. He did? So, but again, it's this whole idea of that if all that one is left with is trust or faith in God alone, is that enough? When one's past has been taken away, as we all know in life, our pasts are taken away, though so many of us want to continue to live in the past, nostalgically. And one's future is not even for sure, though still there's a lot of us that still sort of, project everything into a future that's not yet, right? If all of that is gone, and that's the whole point of the whole Abraham saga, beginning in chapter 12 of Genesis, and sort of reaches its, its crescendo. It's terrible and awful, and yet majestic crescendo in Genesis 22, in the sacrifice of Isaac. So if one's past is gone, remember he's told to leave his native place, the land of his birth, and his father's house, right, in Genesis 12. And then in Genesis 22, he's told, and it's in this threefold way, Isaac is described to him, his son, his only one whom he loves, right? So these 3 and 3. 3 ways that Abraham is related to his past. The 3 ways that Abraham is related to his future. If all of that is gone, it means ultimately that there's nothing that can be an idol. Because we can easily make our futures or our offspring or our progeny idols. We can easily make the past and things that happened in the past, or this event, or this person, idols. If all one has is God, the Lord God right now, or in the present rather, is that enough? Right? And that's ultimately what the whole story of Abraham is about. Right? So anyway, I think there's this movie coming out. It looks interesting. I hope that they sort of really tease out the subtlety, and it's not just this sort of, pastel version of, hold on a minute, the sort of, pastel version of the Abraham story, but that it really gets to sort of the, just the moral difficulty, and the nuance of the story that's there, right? So anyway, I just sort of bring that up because I think it sort of underscores, again, what the writer of Revelation is ultimately saying. When everything, including even the basic elements of creation itself, might not be there, right? The sun and moon are dark, everything seems to be collapsing and all of that, right? This is sort of the great test. This is the sort of the great eschatological test that we all hope that, what we pray in the Lord's Prayer actually, when we say, lead us not into temptation, this is what we're praying that we don't have to go through. but a lot of times in small and large ways we do. Right? But when this sort of happens, right, in small, writ small, like individually in each of our lives, and maybe it's happened in different ways, or writ large in the total, and think of the utter collapse of society and creation and all of that. Writ large, can one still abide, remain, put their trust and faith in God, right? The Lord is good to those who trust in Him, to the one that seeks Him. It is good to hope in silence for the Lord's deliverance. It is good for a person when young to bear the yoke, to sit alone and in silence when its weight lies heavy, to put one's mouth to the dust. There may yet be hope. Right? Those are powerful verses there in Lamentations. So, as you sort of continue with the, just these woes that are coming and the destruction, if you will, of the creation, right? Verse 20 and 21, and again, it sort of brings up other issues. So, chapter 9, verse 20. The rest of humankind who were not killed by these plagues did not repent of the works of their hands or give up worshiping demons and idols of gold and silver and bronze and stone and wood which cannot see or hear or walk. This is like Psalm 115. And they did not repent of their murders or their sorceries or their fornication or their thefts. Right? So it's interesting still that even though, you can have, and this is an interesting idea that the biblical writer is sort of presenting. You can sort of have everything falling down around you, and by God, you're still going to trust, or a person is still going to trust in, their quote-unquote idols, right? It's amazing. Again, you go back to the story of the journey of Israel through the desert. They just witnessed God delivering them at the sea. And all they can do is long for going back to Egypt. At least our bellies were full by the flesh pots of Egypt. Why did you bring us out to this stinking desert to die? Right? It's something... so you got to begin to think sort of in this, what are the core sort of very, very fundamental features of these texts of Scripture pointing to? What is it anthropologically or sociologically or psychologically or spiritually in a human being that, though they might be thrust into the liminal experience of the desert or the wasteland or the wilderness or the cross, they will still, by God, deny that is happening. And so, denial is not just a river in Egypt, of course, but it is, right? But people will just live from that. The whole idea of what we sometimes joke about, the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and over again, expecting a different result. And yet, how often people do that? How often I do that? How often someone does that? Right? And so, that even then, when you have sort of like the in-your-face experience of the seeming, cataclysmic destruction of things, people will still revert to sort of their old ways, thinking they're idols, thinking that this will get me through it, right? That I will, and yet it doesn't work anymore. won't work anymore, right? So I think that that's sort of a deeper spiritual, anthropological, or psychological truth that, sort of we can pull out, tease out from the book of Revelation. In this regard, right? In these sort of these middle chapters, which are very, very, very intense and dark, and just wants to sort of underscore the seeming overwhelming power of the destruction, right? Sort of like Joel's day of the Lord. And yet that somehow, though, as I was referencing earlier, that day of the Lord is not the end. That there's still an opportunity for transformation, right? As we sort of saw the passage that immediately follows in Joel chapter 2. So I'll sort of leave us hanging there, or with that, that sort of provides us a clean break to then go into then what's going to be the beginning of the sort of the battle, if you will, in the heavens between the forces of good, the forces of God, that will sort of mark particularly chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13 of Revelation, over the forces of evil, the devil, Satan, and all of that. And then we'll set in the trajectory leading to the new heavens and the new earth of the new creation. Right? So again, there's always that hopeful element, right? Again, going back to that very enigmatic, mysterious passage in Lamentations 3, to put one's mouth in the dust, there may yet be hope. That's interesting. Very, very powerful. Okay, I'll stop there. I hope you all have a good evening. Thank you so much.